different people from so many different places. You wouldn't expect that in one place, but that really is the case down here. It is a great state, and it's been given a wonderful motto. You know, I've always come, basically anyway, to Florida during, I guess, what is the rainy season of the year, and for the longest time, I couldn't understand your all's motto, the Sunshine State. That made no sense to me. It was like the rain state. It rained every day. But now I understand. In the non-rainy season, truly it is the Sunshine State. And there's sunshine during the rainy season too. It's just not all day long. But it is a great state, and it's a great motto that you all have. In meeting a lot of different people in this one place from many different places, I've been a little bit impressed to find just how many people have come from Missouri that are here. If you don't mind for tonight, raise your hand, if you will, if you are from the state of Missouri or if you're originally from the state of Missouri. Or Sherry, Kevin, if you spent any. Oh, yeah. No. Okay. Well, there's a lot of people who spent some time in Missouri, and I know through the course of our lives we do some traveling as well. Well, just like every other state, including Florida, in Missouri we have a motto, and we're proud of our motto, just like you're probably proud of your motto here as well. Missouri is the show me state. And what we mean by that remark is, if you show us, then we'll believe you. Okay, and in one sense, that's kind of good. When you're working with fellow human beings, especially if you're in business, it's often to be showed before you'll believe somebody. That's probably a pretty good way of going about things. You know, I think the state of Missouri's motto represents the human race pretty well. That's generally how we look at things. But God, in His involvement with us, He expects us to look at Him in a different light. Man likes to live by Missouri's motto, show me and then I'll trust you. God has a little different way of approaching things. He wants us to trust Him, and then He will show us. Our text tonight is going to come from the 11th chapter of John. If you would like to open to that place, John chapter 11. But before we get to that place, I would like to go from verse 1 all the way to the end in verse 57. We're not going to be able to do that tonight. I want to be respectful of your time. And so what I want to do is I want to just basically give a synopsis of the first 16 verses of John 11. There are these three siblings who live in the small town of Bethany. Their names are Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. These are very close people to Jesus. Lazarus gets sick with some ailment about which we know very little, but we know it was very serious because he's on the verge of death. And so the sisters send to Jesus and they ask Him, hey, come and do something about this, or our brother and your dear friend is going to die. And it's really weird when Jesus hears this, but He says, no, I know, and this sickness is going to be for the glory of God. And He sticks around purposely for 2 more days in this town so that He makes sure Lazarus is good and dead before He goes and visits these 3 siblings. Now, this isn't because Jesus has disdain for these people, but He feels toward them just like they feel toward Him. It's stated in verse 5 of John 11 that Jesus loves dearly all 3 of these individuals. Well, later on He mentions to His disciples, okay, now it's time for us to go back into Judea, which is where Bethany is found. And He says, our friend Lazarus is asleep, and I need to go there so I can wake him up. Well, the disciples say, Lord, if he's sick and he's sleeping, why don't we just leave him that way? He needs his rest, and then he'll get better, and we'll visit with him more later. He says, no, you guys aren't getting it. I mean, Lazarus is dead. Remember from yesterday the difference in the human perspective and the divine perspective of death? He's just taking a nap. I'm going to go wake him up. Well, let's let him sleep, Lord. No, he's dead, and I need to go raise him from the dead. And then right after that, Jesus says this, and I am glad for your sakes that I wasn't there to stop his death so that you might believe. Now, I want you to hang on to that for later on in the lesson. But that's the point at which we pick up in our reading in John 11. We're going to start in verse 17 with the idea of man says, show me, and I'll trust you. Verses 17 through 20 of John 11. When Jesus came, He found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha went and met Him, but Mary was left behind, still sitting in the house. If you like scholastic endeavors, you might like tonight's lesson. If you weren't too fond of school, I'm sorry, you might not like the evening's lesson. We're going to have to venture into a few subjects of school that are really important in this lesson, and those two are geography and their language grammar. And let's go ahead and start with maybe the most undesirable of all. and let's start with geography. Geography is extremely significant in our study tonight. Now, there are two Bethanies in the Bible. There is the Bethany of Judea, which is in close proximity to Jerusalem. And then there is Bethany, what's called beyond the Jordan. And sometimes you read about this place in the Bible, Bethabara. And that's the same place as Bethany that is found beyond the Jordan. Well, we're not talking tonight about Bethany beyond the Jordan. I just point that out because when a town has the same name, at times it can get a little bit confusing. Last fall, I had the privilege of holding a meeting with the Tupelo Church of Christ. And when I would tell people, when they'd ask me, where are you going this time? I said, I'm going to Tupelo, Oklahoma. I said, well, wait a minute. I thought Tupelo was in Mississippi. I said, well, it is. This is another one. Come to find out, there's actually a third Tupelo in the U.S., and that's in Arkansas as well. I didn't know about either of those two before I was invited to that meeting. But what you have is Tupelo on the east side of the river, the Mississippi, and then you have Tupelo on the west side of the Mississippi in Oklahoma. Well, it's similar with Bethany. You have Bethany on the east side of the river, not the Mississippi, but the Jordan. And you have Bethany on the west side. Well, we're focusing on Bethany of Judea. And the reason that it's important to understand that's only 2 miles away from Jerusalem is that Jerusalem is the hub for Israelite activity. It has been for about 1,000 years up to this point since David moved the capital from Hebron to Jerusalem. And with just brief interruptions, Jerusalem was the hub of all Israelite activity, especially things that pertain to worship and the leadership of God's people. If you're an important person among God's people, there's a good chance that you live under the Old Testament in or around the city of Jerusalem. Now, what's important about that is these people don't like Jesus very much. And they're looking for any excuse that they can, any big occurrence that they can use and try to twist it around to put him to death. And because Bethany is only located a couple of miles away from Jerusalem, if there's a big occurrence that takes place in this suburb of Jerusalem, news is going to travel very quickly to where these religious leaders are. I'm going to guess you're pretty familiar already with John 11. There's a big occurrence that's about to transpire. And they're going to catch word of what it is that's taking place in this location. And it's not by coincidence that just a little ways down the line, that Christ is going to lose his life just right outside Jerusalem proper on a hill that you and I understand to be called Calvary. It has everything to do with the location of this place being in such close proximity of Jerusalem. I like the Greek wording about Lazarus and how long he's been in the tomb. Literally, he is a fourth-day man, is what that means from the Scriptures. And the idea is that he's already been buried for 4 days. Now, to you and I, this means this, that the visitation has already taken place, the funeral has already occurred, they've already had the dinner the family has together, the burial has already transpired, everything's done. Well, it's the same thing in their culture as well. But the fact that he's been in the tomb for 4 days probably means that he's also been dead for 4 days, because typically people of that culture would bury the body the same day that the people died. Heat. Over in the Middle East, it's a lot like heat. In Florida, it's just a little bit drier than what this is. If there's a deceased animal carcass at the side of the road that somebody has hit, that doesn't stick around for very long, does it? Well, it's the same thing over there in this hot climate. Typically, they would bury bodies very quickly. They didn't utilize the embalming process that you and I do or the early type that the Egyptians employed. And so they would bury that body often the same day that the person died. He's probably been dead for 4 days. We certainly know that he's been in the tomb for 4 days. That's on purpose as far as Jesus goes. He wanted it to be that way. And he shows up, and here Martha comes out to greet him, his close friend, and the sister of this man who's passed away. John 11, verses 23 and 24, Jesus said to her, Martha, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, Lord, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. What we're going to start employing now is language grammar, and in particular, I want us to focus on verb tenses. Of the three major, which verb tense is being utilized here by both parties? The future verb tense. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Now, the future verb tense can be used in one of two ways, either for the remote future or for the immediate future. Meaning, I'm talking like a long time from now, or I'm talking like in a few hours. Either one is future tense, though, and Jesus could mean either one by this. Now, Martha understands him very likely to be referring to the remote future, because she says, "Well, I know he's going to rise again, Lord, in the resurrection of the last day." And she thinks that Jesus is just trying to console her with this truth. You remember what the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 4:18 after talking about the final resurrection when Jesus comes back, and he says, "Therefore comfort one another with these words." How many countless servants of God have found comfort in the fact that they will see their faithful loved ones again? I long for that, don't you? I'm excited about the very prospect of that. So Martha thinks that Jesus is just talking about the remote future. One day in the end, Lazarus' body's going to come up again, just like everybody's is going to. But notice what Jesus tells her in verses 25 and 26. No, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? I told you yesterday, members, I'm a backwards kind of guy, so let's start with verse 26 and then let's work our way back to verse 25. Jesus says, "Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." That's not translated very strictly from the original language. Literally, the reading here is, "Whoever lives and believes in me shall not never die." You see why we didn't translate it that way now? That doesn't sound right. That's employing a double negative. And if we learn anything from English class, you're not supposed to use no double negatives, right? Well, Kevin has a strong grasp on the English language. He's excellent at his usage of it. I doubt Kevin uses any double negatives when he speaks, but have you ever heard Kevin say something like, "If you'll allow me the double negative," and he says, I don't know if he does that or not. I'm not as good with English as what he is. However, I do say that every now and then, and I'll use a double negative. I do so on purpose because I'm trying to emphasize a point, even though that's not formal usage in speaking or writing. Well, the Greeks were the same way. It wasn't formal for them to speak with double negatives, and especially not to write with double negatives, but it is interesting how many times double negatives are found in the Scriptures. And it's intentionally that way. Because Jesus, the master and inventor of all languages, understands how you're supposed to speak and how you're not. It's just he's trying to make such a strong point. It's really not enough for him to say, "Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." That's not enough. What he's saying is there is an absolute nil prospect that if you have your trust in me and you follow my will, that you will ever die. But the only way I know of expressing to you that to you properly is whoever lives and believes in me shall not never die. Do you believe this? We're going back up to verse 25. Did you notice the switch in verb tense? As Jesus sees, she's not understanding what I'm telling her right now. Jesus, instead of saying, "I will be the resurrection and the life," although that's very true, he switches from the future to the present verb tense, and he says, "Martha, I am right now the resurrection and the life." I'm not talking about I'm going to raise your brother's body in the end, although yeah, I am going to do that. I'm saying I'm about to raise your brother from the dead right now. Do you believe this very specific fact? Verse 27, she said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." And what I'm about to say, I don't intend to take a shred of credit away from Martha for this wonderful affirmation of faith that she makes in Jesus. Truthfully, I don't think we give her enough credit for it. You know, if we talk about someone who makes a tremendous confession of faith, who do we always bring up first? We do Peter, don't we? Oh yeah, Matthew 16:16. I believe you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. You realize Martha says exactly the same thing, only minus one article and one adjective. Exactly the same thing Peter did. But when Jesus asked Peter this question, it's very general. Who do you say that I am? But when he asks Martha, he does so with a very pointed question. Martha, do you believe that right now I am the resurrection and the life? In other words, do you believe that I'm about to bring the body of your deceased brother out of the tomb right now? Well, Lord, I believe you're the Christ, the Son of God. Well, that's a great statement, isn't it? But that's not a proper answer to the question that Jesus has just asked. Have you ever watched a debate between politicians? And the moderator will ask this excellent question. And it will be very specific, very pointed to one of the candidates. And the candidate will go into this 5-minute spiel that could have been answered in one word. And at the end of it, you say, I agree with everything that's been said there. That was a really good answer. And then you get to thinking, wait a minute, that didn't even touch the question that the moderator just asked. Even though it was a great statement that was made, I think Martha might have missed her calling. I think she could be a wonderful politician. Jesus asked her a very pointed question. She makes a tremendous statement, but she doesn't address the question and the answer that she gives to Jesus. Martha, do you believe right now that I am the resurrection and the life? Well, I believe you're the Christ, the Son of God. But does she really believe? You go back into verses 21 and 22, it seems that perhaps she does. Then Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's unclear what tone here she's taking with Jesus. It could be accusatory or it could be declarative. And what I mean by that is she could have been saying, Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother never would have died. Or it could be simply a statement of fact, Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. It's hard to tell what tone is from biblical text. By the way, a helpful fact of life, it's hard to tell the tone of text messages also. Have you ever noticed that? I learned here a while back that if you send capitalized words in a text message, some people think you're yelling at them when you're not intending to do so. Well, you got to be careful reading too much as far as tone goes into fact. Well, that's the case with biblical text too. Sometimes we don't know the tone of the speaker, and it could be understood in one of two ways. Either this is accusatory or it's declarative. But this much we do know, verse 22, even now, Martha says, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. That sounds like she believes that Jesus could still raise him from the dead, doesn't it? But does she really believe that he's going to do that? Before we answer that, let's consider a little bit more about the sister of this lady. Verses 32 and 33, then Mary came where Jesus was and saw him and fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Does that sound familiar? You get a couple of sisters who live in close proximity to one another, and quite possibly with these living in the same house together all day, every day. And it may just be, if you've talked to one, you've already talked to the other. These two have probably been talking about this for 4 days together, and she states verbatim before the Lord exactly what her sister Martha did. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit, and he was troubled. Now, these are two intriguing verbs here. He groaned in the spirit, and he was troubled. The background of this term, groan, means to snort like a horse. You like that? Something along the lines of, I'm only doing that once, by the way. Well, this isn't a horse, though, who's snorting. This is a person that's doing so. And the closest thing to that would be something like, and the other verb that's used is he was troubled. Literally, this verb means to shake or to shudder. Now, if you see someone over in a corner, what would you conclude about that person's emotions? It's one of two things. It may be two of two things. Either Jesus is very frustrated and or Jesus is very sad. I don't like to share a lot of opinions, lessons. I'm going to share one with you tonight based on the evidence that I find, but I encourage you to draw your own conclusions from it to take home. I believe Jesus is very frustrated in this situation. He's just been telling everybody, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe in me? And those closest to him seem to have struggles with believing that's the case. By the way, have you noticed that Jesus, even though Lazarus has been dead for many days, hasn't shed a single tear yet? And if you go back to the early part of John 11, after Lazarus dies, he actually uses this word, I am glad that I was not here to stop it from happening. He was actually happy that Lazarus was in that state. I don't believe he's sad because Lazarus dies. Moving on into verse 34, and he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. We're so familiar with the next verse, I'm not even going to put it on the screen tonight. You can see it in your own Bibles, but you don't need to look at it. You know what it is. Everybody's favorite memory verse. The shortest in the Scriptures in the English text, right? Jesus wept. I find it very interesting that Jesus doesn't weep when he finds out that Lazarus has died. He doesn't weep when he comes into the setting. Initially, he sees all these people crying. What's really interesting to me is this. Jesus doesn't weep until he begins his approach to the tomb. Now, if he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead, which we all know that he is, why would he be crying about that if he's sad that Lazarus has passed away? I don't believe he's sad that Lazarus has died. In fact, earlier the Scripture says that he was happy that that was the case. I believe he's sad because he's about to bring Lazarus back to life. He's sad because he knows he has to risk one of his best friends' eternity just to try to produce a little bit of trust in all these faithless people's hearts. Look on in verse 37. And some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? They're referring back to the instance of John chapter 9. There's the man who is born blind, and Jesus helps him out to be able to see. And something that formerly blind man states after he's healed and giving his required testimony before the Jewish council, he says to them, never since the beginning of the world has it been known that a man who is born blind has had his eyes open. We've never seen that before. And yet this man has showed it to us. Question for you. Did these people believe that Jesus could open this guy's eyes before he did it? They had to be showed before they would trust in him, right? And now they're talking, wait a minute, this is the guy who opened the eyes of the blind. If he had showed up before this guy was dead, couldn't he have probably saved him? Well, yeah. But now he's dead. What could he do about it now? We've never seen a dead guy rise from the dead, or we've never seen a guy rise from the dead. Yeah, but he's already showed you something that you've never seen before. Do you think he might be able to show you something else that you've never seen before? Do you believe that I'm able to do this? Verses 38 and 39. Then Jesus, again groaning in himself. You see, this is the second time that we see the same emotion that takes place prior to his weeping. Snorting like a horse, but he's a human being doing it. He's shaking, he's shuddering. When he comes to the tomb, he's bothered he's bothered with what he's about to do to raise this man from the dead. It was a cave and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Did Martha really believe? Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, I don't think that's a good idea. By this time there's a stench. He's already been dead 4 days. This is the second occurrence of he's literally a fourth-day man. Does Martha really think that body's going to be coming out of the tomb? I know a little bit earlier she shows some faith, but I think it's one of those instances of, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Or, Lord, I want to believe, but I just can't quite trust that far. It seems like that's the instance with Martha right here. Jesus is about to do for this family what this family cannot do for themselves. But I find it remarkable that before Jesus does for them what they cannot do for themselves, he first requires them to do for themselves what they can. There are many times God gives us the promise, trust in me, and I will do for you what you cannot do for yourself. But many times he makes us do for ourselves what we can before he will do for us what we cannot. Jesus is about to bring a lifeless body out of the grave that has been in the burial chamber for 4 days. Nobody's ever seen anything like this before. But before it's going to be done, he says, you have to take away the stone. I'm convinced that if they didn't at least display enough faith in him to personally remove that stone, there's no body that's coming out of the grave. But they still don't believe Jesus can do anything about it. Because the way human beings look at things is show me and I'll trust you. But Jesus looks at things from a slightly varying perspective. He says, trust me and I'll show you. Verse 40 of our text, Jesus said to her, that is to Martha, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? Let's plug in our buzzword synonyms in this verse. Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you would trust me, I would show you the glory of God? Everyone around there has the mentality, well, show us and then we'll trust you. Jesus says, no, that's not what interests me. What I want to see is trust in me, and then I'll show you. Verses 43 and 44, now when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth! And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus started running around and doing cartwheels and backflips and high-fiving people. And he runs over to Lazarus and hugs him and kisses him. We don't find any of that, do we? In fact, we don't see any excitement of Jesus that's displayed in this episode. You can't read tone in Scripture, but it seems to be something like, loose him and let him go. Jesus isn't happy about this. He's disgusted that nobody trusts in him and who he is and what he's about to show them. Time and time and time again, he has to show them before they'll trust him. I ask you to notice the result of this in verses 45 through 48. Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him. Let's plug our words in there. The Jews who had come to Mary and had been showed the things Jesus did trusted in him. They did things man's way, didn't they? But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Remember, it's not far away in Jerusalem. And they're going to find out very quickly. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council together and said, what shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone's going to believe in him. Let's plug our synonymous words in there. What are we going to do? This man shows many people. If we leave him alone, everyone's going to put their trust in him on the basis of what they showed him, or what he showed them. Now, from the human Christian perspective, we look at that and we say, man, that's great. Yeah, Jesus, keep showing them. He doesn't just keep showing people these kinds of things all the time, because that's not the pattern that impresses Jesus. If he's got to show you before you'll trust him, he's not pleased by that. He wants you to trust him that he will show you when the time is right. Don't take my word for it. Take his. You recall the account of Thomas? The first time Jesus shows up after his resurrection with the 10 apostles, and behind closed doors, somehow he kind of teleports in there. He's Jesus. He can do whatever he wants. And Thomas, for whatever reason, isn't present. And afterward, his buddies go to him, and they say, this is the coolest thing. We've seen Jesus. He's risen from the dead. Thomas' reaction is, yeah, right. Well, unless I see the print of the nails in his hands and the print of the nails in his feet, and I put my finger in them, unless I see the hole that the spear left in his side, and I can put my hand into his side, there's no way I'm ever going to believe it. You show me, and then I'll trust you. Well, that next Sunday, thankfully Thomas was with a bunch of them. Jesus shows up and he says, peace be to you. I'm not here to hurt you. I know the doors were closed and I came in anyway. Nobody be afraid. He says, Thomas, come here. I want to talk to you. He says, you see these holes in my hands? These holes in my feet? I want you to come put your finger in those. You see this hole that the spear left in my side? Go ahead and thrust your hand in that. And this time, don't be unbelieving, but believing. It's at that point in time, verses 28 and 29 of John 20, that Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Employing our words here that we're using in the lesson, because you have been showed, you now trust. Blessed are those who have not yet been showed and yet do trust. I encourage you when you go home tonight or as you're sitting in your pew with your Bible open, I know that we don't have many verses of this on the screen, but look at all the verses before that and all the verses after, and search until you find the blessing that's pronounced on Thomas, that after he showed, then he trusts in Jesus. But don't look for very long because you're wasting your time. It's not there. Folks, there's no blessing when God first has to show us something that He says is true about Himself or something that's true about His will before we'll trust in Him. Rather, the blessing is found in first trusting Him, and then He'll show us whenever the time is right. He told everyone all around, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? Well, you show us, and we'll believe you. How many times did He tell His own apostles that once He was betrayed and crucified, He would be raised from the dead? And yet they're as surprised as anyone whenever He actually rises from the dead. They had to be showed before they would trust in Him. I'm telling you, there's something meaningful in this lesson for us today. Jesus has yet one more promise about the resurrection from the dead. John 5:28 and 29, He says, Do not marvel at this, because the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear His voice and come forth. Just like He did with Lazarus, only He's going to drop the name. And when He returns, He's just going to say, Come forth! And everyone is going to come out of the graves. And at that point, how many people do you think are going to believe that Jesus is right now, the resurrection and the life? Folks, every person who's alive, every person who's ever lived will believe at that point. But they're all going to be blessed then? The only people who are going to be blessed in the end are first already trusted that it was going to happen, and they knew that God would show them when the time is right. Jesus is right now. It's true He will be, but He is right now the resurrection and the life. And the resurrection of the body has everything to do with you and me and our salvation right now. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 17, if Christ is not raised, your faith is futile, and you're still dead in your sins. And the reason for that is when God tells us in a place like Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, in Him you are also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of sins by the circumcision of Christ. You were buried with Him in baptism, in which you were also raised with Him to live for Christ. You see, the whole reason we do this, even though it involves water, it's not about the water itself. It's about Christ. And God has chosen water simply as the medium by which we come into contact with His Son. We are reenacting in baptism the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. But if Christ isn't risen from the dead, then all of that means absolutely nothing. But because He has been raised from the dead, it means absolutely everything. And it's possible for us to sit back today and say, I would really like to experience salvation. God, you show me your salvation, and then I'll put my trust in you. Salvation doesn't work that way, does it? That's the way man looks at it. God says, no, you show me how much you trust in me, and then I'll show you my salvation. Have you been buried with Christ and risen to live with Him on the basis of His death, His burial, and His resurrection for you? Who's in control of your life right now? Is it Him, or is it someone of a far more wicked influence? As a child of God, when we allow sin to creep into our lives and to begin to control us, there's a powerful vehicle whereby the Scriptures tell us that problem can be fixed. James chapter 5 declares in verse 15 that prayer will save the sick. Talking about a person who's ailing in the body. Recall that from yesterday. And if he has committed sins, he will be raised up. Prayer has the power to do that. But if we're a wayward child of God, we can't just sit back and say, I tell you what, God, you show me your salvation a second time, and then I'll put my faith in you. No, God says it's the prayer of a certain kind, a prayer of faith, that allows the forgiveness of sins to take place. He says through penitent prayer, you show me your faith in me, and then I'll show you my salvation. Tonight, as you look at your own life, Where is your trust found? It's so easy to look at things from the human perspective. Man says, show me, and I'll trust you. God says, no, I require something a little different. Trust me, and then I'll show you. And tonight, if you could use the mighty deliverance of God in your life, there is nothing more that He would like to do tonight to show you His salvation. And that's exactly what He'll do if you'll come put your trust in Him while we stand and sing to encourage.